The stars had always been humanity's beacon of wonder, a vast expanse that stretched beyond imagination, filled with mysteries. But for the first time in history, the stars would be the harbingers of humanity's greatest challenge. The Gorlith Empire, a ruthless and expansive intergalactic force, had set its sights on Earth. A fleet of warships, dark and menacing, emerged from the void of space, their hulls glistening with unknown technologies. The Gorlith were conquerors, and they had come for Earth. The alien fleet, numbering in the hundreds, entered the solar system with chilling precision. Massive battleships, each the size of a city, loomed over the planets. These ships, equipped with weapons that could obliterate entire fleets in moments, were the pride of the Gorlith military. Their commanders, cold and calculating, believed that Earth was nothing more than a primitive speck in the vastness of the universe, ripe for plunder. The Gorlith had already conquered countless worlds, civilizations that had once thrived, now reduced to nothing but dust. They had no reason to believe that Earth would be any different. Their fleet was equipped with technology that far surpassed anything humanity had ever dreamed of. They had long-range weapons that could slice through shields and hulls with ease, energy disruptors that rendered any defensive measure useless, and war drones that could swarm planets and wipe them clean of life. As the Gorlith fleet approached, Earth's governments scrambled in a panic. Across the world, leaders held emergency meetings, debating how to respond to the unimaginable. The global network of military forces sent out their best defenses, but no one had ever seen anything like this. The Gorlith ships moved with precision, their sheer numbers overwhelming Earth's defenses before they could even be fully mobilized. In every major city, from New York to Beijing, people stared up at the skies in disbelief. News broadcasts, once full of trivial reports, now showed images of the approaching alien fleet. Panic began to spread like wildfire. Military experts gave grim forecasts. Earth's defenses, they said, were inadequate. The world had spent centuries advancing in technology, but it had never prepared for an enemy like this. Governments declared a state of emergency, but no one knew what to do. Meanwhile, deep beneath the surface of Earth, a hidden project, long forgotten by the world, began to stir. In the deepest bunkers and ancient facilities, humankind's last line of defense slowly powered up. These were ships built in a time long past, before Earth had turned its attention to the stars. They were relics of an era when humanity was capable of creating advanced military technology, an era when they had fought not for conquest, but for survival. These ships, scattered and abandoned, were thought to be nothing more than a footnote in history. But now, they were about to make their presence known. As the Gorlith ships continued their inexorable approach, Earth's people held their breath. The world was on the edge of annihilation, and no one could fathom how a planet with no real spacefaring military could possibly stand against an empire that had crushed civilizations across galaxies. The alien fleet was too powerful, and Earth's forces were too weak. The Gorlith had already won, or so they thought. But something was about to happen that would shake the Gorlith to their core, a force they had never expected, a force they could not have predicted. And with it, humanity's fight for survival would begin. The Gorlith commanders, confident in their impending victory, began issuing orders for the final stages of their invasion. The fleet had already entered Earth's orbit, and they expected a swift, effortless conquest. The initial response from Earth's military had been nothing more than a faint resistance, easily crushed by their superior technology. Earth's cities were already beginning to burn, and the countdown to total occupation had begun. They believed there was nothing left to stop them. But as the Gorlith fleet advanced, something unexpected happened. A signal, faint and irregular, began to echo through the darkness of space, emanating from deep within the solar system. It was a strange, coded transmission that appeared to be coming from an area near the outer planets. At first, the Gorlith commanders dismissed it as a glitch, perhaps an error in their advanced scanning systems. But as the signal persisted, their curiosity grew. The transmission wasn't one the Gorlith had ever encountered before. It was a series of signals, old and fragmented, but unmistakably human in origin. It was the type of transmission one might expect from a forgotten satellite, long since abandoned. Yet, as the Gorlith narrowed their focus on it, they realized that the signal was emanating from a specific location. Earth. Something was hidden. Something they hadn't anticipated. As the Gorlith fleet paused in their advance to investigate the source, the true scale of the surprise became apparent. Deep within Earth's oceans and beneath its vast mountain ranges lay a series of enormous, camouflaged bases, long sealed and forgotten by time. These were the remnants of an ancient human project, known only to a select few and lost to history. The project had been initiated centuries ago, in the midst of a forgotten war, when humanity had faced an enemy so powerful that their survival depended on creating a fleet capable of defending their homeworld. Now, as if responding to a forgotten call, the ancient fleet was awakening from its dormant state. These were no ordinary ships. They were relics of a bygone era, crafted with technology far beyond anything humanity had ever publicly revealed. Built to endure the harshest conditions of space, and armed with weapons that surpassed even the most advanced modern designs, these ships had been left behind, abandoned as humanity moved on. As the first of the vessels powered up, their engines came to life with a low, ominous hum that echoed across Earth's surface. Each ship, buried deep beneath layers of earth and water, began to ascend slowly, breaking through the surface like leviathans rising from the deep. The once forgotten fleet, a silent giant, had been reawakened. The ships were sleek and angular, their hulls made from alloys unknown to the Gorlith, metals that defied their attempts to study or replicate. Their weaponry, concealed for centuries, began to charge, pulse cannons that crackled with raw energy, capable of devastating entire enemy fleets with a single blast. But it wasn't just the ships that were a mystery to the Gorlith. It was the humans aboard them. The crews were veterans of ancient wars, men and women whose ancestors had built these ships, and whose bloodline was steeped in combat and strategy. They were not the average human, but a breed honed for survival and war. The first fleet of these mysterious ships broke through Earth's atmosphere, and the Gorlith immediately recognized them as a threat. It was an enemy they had never encountered, humanity's last line of defense. But the Gorlith were not yet worried. After all, the fleet was small, the humans outnumbered, and their tactics were primitive. They couldn't fathom what was to come. The battle for Earth had only just begun, and the Gorlith had just made their first critical mistake. They had underestimated the resourcefulness and hidden power of humanity. What they didn't know was that this fleet, these ancient ships, weren't just weapons. They were symbols of something much more terrifying, the indomitable spirit of mankind. And the Gorlith would soon find out exactly what that meant. The Gorlith fleet, having just recovered from the shock of the mysterious fleet's emergence, quickly realized that humanity's relics were no mere threats. The first human ships, emerging from their deep-hidden bunkers, took up formation, their hulls gleaming like specters in the cold expanse of space. The Gorlith, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, braced for what they assumed would be a final, futile attempt by Earth's forces to resist. But they had vastly underestimated the power of these ancient vessels. Humanity's fleet did not waste time with grand speeches or lengthy declarations. There was no room for fear or hesitation. As soon as the human ships locked onto their targets, they struck with deadly precision. The first wave of fire was a barrage of energy blasts, brilliant arcs of light that tore through the darkness of space, slicing into the Gorlith ships like knives through paper. The Gorlith tried to retaliate, launching energy missiles and laser beams in every direction, but the human fleet was already gone, moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for ships of their size. The Gorlith couldn't keep up. Their sensors, advanced though they were, couldn't track the sudden, erratic movements of the human fleet. The Earth ships weren't engaging in straightforward dogfights like the Gorlith had anticipated. Instead, they darted between asteroids, weaving in and out of planetary rings, using every natural resource at their disposal to hide and strike from unexpected angles. The Gorlith commanders, accustomed to enemies who fought in predictable patterns, were caught off guard. One by one, the first wave of Gorlith ships began to fall. Massive warships, once thought invincible, erupted into fiery explosions as human pulse cannons cracked their shields and tore into their armored hulls. The explosions sent shockwaves through the Gorlith ranks, disrupting their formation and forcing them into disarray. They fired blindly into the void, trying to lock onto the elusive human ships, but it was too late. The human fleet had already struck and vanished, leaving nothing but the glowing embers of their enemies in their wake. The Gorlith retaliated with everything they had left: swarming drums that rained down on the humans, deadly energy waves that rippled through space, and heavy artillery that was designed to crush anything in its path. But again, humanity was one step ahead. The ancient ships, though old, were built with a level of craftsmanship that allowed them to adapt, even to the most advanced weapons of the Gorlith. With every attack the Gorlith launched, the human fleet responded with quick, deadly tactics, evading, countering, and then vanishing before the Gorlith could retaliate. The battle was not just a fight for survival, it was a brutal dance of wits, with the Gorlith struggling to adjust their tactics, while the humans seemed to anticipate their every move. The Gorlith had counted on overwhelming Earth with sheer power, but instead they were facing an enemy that fought with an unpredictable and deadly precision. For every ship they destroyed, the humans took down 2 or 3 in return. On Earth, the world watched in awe as the unexpected battle unfolded. Governments, once crippled by fear and doubt, now watched in disbelief as humanity's defenders made their stand. The news was filled with reports of the invaders being pushed back, of Gorlith warships collapsing into debris fields. Across the globe, people began to realize that they were not helpless. Earth was not defenseless against this alien threat. Back in space, the Gorlith commanders, who had once believed Earth was an easy target, now began to understand the true scope of their mistake. They had not only underestimated the military capabilities of humanity, they had underestimated the sheer determination of a species willing to do whatever it took to survive. The Gorlith had expected a quick, effortless victory. What they were getting instead was a fight for their lives. And it was only just beginning. The Gorlith commanders stood on the bridge of their flagship, their expressions twisted in disbelief. The reports flooding in were nearly impossible to comprehend. Their fleet, vast, technologically superior, and unbeatable, was faltering. Gorlith warships, once feared throughout the galaxy, were now being torn apart by the humans' mysterious fleet. How could this be? Their advanced tracking systems, capable of detecting the most elusive of enemies, were failing to lock onto the human vessels. These ships, which should have been primitive and easy to destroy, were instead moving with a fluidity and precision that seemed almost otherworldly. As the Gorlith watched, another human ship, a sleek, angular craft that had appeared from the shadows of an asteroid belt, dropped out of warp and fired, catching one of their largest cruisers by surprise. The cruiser's shields flared under the onslaught, but the human vessel's weapons easily pierced through, sending the Gorlith ship spiraling out of control before it erupted in a fiery explosion. The Gorlith commanders recoiled, stunned by the sight. Their massive fleets, which had swept through countless systems, were now facing the impossible. "Focus fire on the human ships," one of the commanders barked, but his orders were met with hesitation. The human fleet was unpredictable. The Gorlith had no frame of reference for this kind of warfare. They expected the humans to fight like animals, charging headlong into battle. Instead, they were fighting like a cunning, ancient species with an intimate understanding of warfare, fighting like a predator in its prime. On the battlefield, the human ships continued to strike relentlessly, darting in and out of the fight with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Every time the Gorlith tried to organize their ships into a defensive formation, the humans would scatter, strike from a different angle, and then disappear back into the darkness of space. The Gorlith, for the first time in their invasion, felt like they were being hunted rather than the hunters. The human tactics were bewildering. The Gorlith ships, designed for direct confrontation and overwhelming firepower, were ill-equipped for the guerrilla warfare that humanity had mastered. In the vastness of space, the humans used the planets, the asteroid belts, and even the rings of Saturn to their advantage. They didn't fight like invaders. They fought like survivors, moving through the chaos with deadly efficiency. And it was this relentless, unpredictable style of warfare that left the Gorlith reeling. With each battle, the Gorlith's confidence eroded. The survivors of their previous skirmishes were now reporting the unthinkable. They had underestimated the humans, not just their technology, but their ingenuity and their ability to adapt. The Gorlith, a race that had conquered countless civilizations, were beginning to feel vulnerable, and that vulnerability terrified them. In a desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, the Gorlith deployed their most advanced weaponry. Massive energy disruptors capable of tearing apart entire fleets with a single burst. The energy waves pulsed through space, lighting up the void with their destructive force. But the humans were ready. At the last possible moment, the human fleet's shields flared to life, absorbing the impact. The disruptors were powerful, but they were not enough. The human ships held their ground. And then, in a swift counterattack, the humans unleashed a devastating volley of their own. As another Gorlith battleship fell to the human onslaught, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The Gorlith were no longer just fighting to conquer. They were fighting to survive. The humans had done the impossible. They had made a stand. And as the Gorlith fleet faltered in the face of humanity's unexpected resilience, the universe watched in awe. The question now was not whether Earth would fall, but whether the Gorlith could hold on long enough to escape with their lives. As the Gorlith fleet struggled to regroup, a new and unsettling truth began to seep into their ranks. They had underestimated not just Earth's defense, but humanity itself. The Gorlith had expected to face a disorganized, panicked species, unable to mount a coherent resistance. But instead, they were encountering something far more dangerous. A race with a hidden legacy, a legacy that had remained dormant for centuries. The battle was no longer just about technology or firepower. It was about a history the Gorlith had failed to uncover. The Gorlith commanders turned their focus inward, trying to understand why their superior forces were faltering. As their warships suffered damage and their drones were picked off one by one, they began to analyze the humans' tactics more closely. What they discovered was a chilling revelation. The human fleet, with its bizarre maneuvering and strategic unpredictability, was not a product of modern human ingenuity alone. It was the result of knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that had been buried, forgotten by time. Hidden deep within Earth's history was an ancient civilization, long before the rise of the modern world. These were humans who had faced a deadly existential threat, an enemy so formidable that humanity was forced to build a fleet of unimaginable power. These humans, survivors of that ancient war, had crafted ships with technology far ahead of their time, ships designed not just to survive, but to dominate the stars. But the knowledge of these ships and the war they were created for had been lost to the centuries, until now. The Gorlith commanders dug deeper, seeking any records they could find on the origins of these ships. They soon uncovered the truth. These ships were built during a long-forgotten war, a war that the Gorlith themselves had never known about. The human fleet, composed of these ancient vessels, was a remnant of that time, activated by a secret code, an ancient signal buried deep beneath Earth's surface. These ships, left behind by an older generation of humans, had been forgotten by most of the world, their purpose obscured by the passage of time. But now, they had been reawakened, and the Gorlith were facing a force they couldn't understand. The more the Gorlith discovered about the history of these ships, the more they realized they had miscalculated. The humans were not just fighting with advanced weapons. They were fighting with the wisdom and tactics of an ancient people who had faced a crisis far greater than anything the Gorlith had ever encountered. The human fleet was not a fluke. It was the result of generations of planning, crafting, and surviving against an enemy more terrifying than anything the Gorlith had ever faced. The realization hit the Gorlith like a thunderclap. These ships, though old, were a weapon forged from the very bones of human history. A history of survival, of resilience, and of a refusal to surrender. The Gorlith had been so sure of their superiority, so certain that their advanced technology would crush the humans, that they had never considered the possibility that Earth had a secret weapon far more dangerous than any laser or disruptor. They had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, to learn from its past, and to survive against all odds. With this new knowledge, the Gorlith commanders reevaluated their entire strategy. They knew now that they couldn't simply overwhelm the human fleet. They had to outthink them. But as they launched their most aggressive counterattacks, they found the humans were already several steps ahead. Every move the Gorlith made was anticipated, every strategy countered with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. The Gorlith were fighting a war of attrition, but the humans were playing a game of strategy. A game the Gorlith were losing. In space, the human fleet continued to strike with brutal precision, never allowing the Gorlith to recover from the shock of their initial resistance. And with each passing day, the Gorlith realized more and more that they were not facing an unprepared species, but the last remnants of an ancient civilization. A civilization whose legacy had been preserved in the most unexpected of ways. The battle for Earth had turned from a conquest into a war of survival, and the Gorlith were now fighting against a force they could never have predicted, the living legacy of humanity's past. The Gorlith fleet, once so confident in their superiority, now found themselves trapped in a war they hadn't prepared for. With each passing hour, their ranks continued to thin. Their ships, colossal and once invulnerable, were slowly being picked off by the relentless tactics of the human fleet. The realization had set in among the Gorlith commanders. They had severely underestimated their enemy, and every attempt to recover their lost ground seemed futile. The more they tried to adapt, the more they found themselves outmaneuvered, their every move countered with ruthless efficiency. Inside the Gorlith command center, frustration grew. Their vast armada had been reduced to a fragmented force, each ship now acting independently as the humans picked them apart. The tactics that had worked on countless worlds were ineffective against this unpredictable foe. The humans were no longer just reacting. They were taking the fight to the Gorlith, each strike more devastating than the last. The human fleet had begun to adapt too. The ancient ships, now operating with renewed purpose, weren't just using brute force. They were exploiting every weakness in the Gorlith's technology. The human commanders, well versed in strategy and warfare, understood how to maximize their ship's potential, exploiting the smallest gap in the Gorlith's defenses. The once unstoppable energy disruptors of the Gorlith were being used against them, as the humans found ways to turn the Gorlith's own weapons back onto them. In one decisive battle, a human ship outflanked a Gorlith destroyer by using the gravitational pull of Jupiter's moon, Europa, to hide in its shadow. When the Gorlith ship moved into firing range, it was met with an overwhelming blast of energy that crippled its systems. The destroyer's shields failed, and within moments, the human ship fired a barrage of torpedoes, decimating the Gorlith vessel in a flash of light. The Gorlith fleet could only watch in horror as yet another warship was lost. On Earth, the tide of the war had begun to shift in humanity's favor. News outlets across the world began to broadcast the unexpected victories of the human fleet. People, once paralyzed by fear, now began to rally behind their forces. Support for the war effort surged, with nations uniting as one. Resources that had been used for fear and panic were now repurposed to aid the military effort. The global economy, once in chaos, began to stabilize as the promise of victory became more tangible. Humanity's resolve was stronger than ever. The Gorlith had failed to break the spirit of Earth's people, and now, the very thing the Gorlith had relied on. Fear was working against them. The people of Earth, united in purpose, were ready to do whatever it took to ensure that their planet remained free. But it wasn't just Earth's people who were mobilizing. As the war escalated, neighboring star systems, long under the control of the Gorlith, began to take notice. Messages of resistance and solidarity began to trickle in from across the galaxy. Once thought to be subjugated for eternity, these systems began to rise up, inspired by Earth's defiance. The Gorlith, once the most feared empire in the galaxy, were now facing an uprising on two fronts, within their own fleet and from the very systems they had conquered. The war for Earth was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming the galaxy from the hands of an empire that had ruled through fear and domination. And as humanity fought for its survival, it began to realize something profound. They were not just defending Earth. They were igniting a revolution that could alter the course of the entire galaxy. The battle was no longer in the hands of the Gorlith. The tide had turned, and humanity's fight for freedom had just become a fight for the very future of the stars themselves. The Gorlith commanders were now facing the brutal truth. They were losing. Their fleets, once proud and unmatched, had been whittled down by human tactics and the unyielding resilience of Earth's defenders. What had begun as an overwhelming invasion had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. With every failed attack, the Gorlith Empire's grip on the galaxy weakened, and the resistance on Earth and beyond grew stronger. But despite the mounting losses, the Gorlith refused to surrender. They were a race bred for conquest, and retreat was a concept foreign to them. On the battlefield, the remaining Gorlith forces began to regroup, pulling their remaining ships into a defensive formation. It was clear now that they couldn't afford to be as scattered as they had been. The last hope for the Gorlith was to launch a decisive, all-out assault, to strike back with everything they had left. They could not afford to lose another battle. The humans, however, were ready. Their fleet, while smaller than it had been at the war's start, was no less lethal. Humanity had fought through every challenge, and now it was prepared to deliver the final blow. Earth's military forces, coordinated and unified like never before, had launched a full-scale offensive. The ancient fleet, the one that had once lain dormant, had become a symbol of humanity's defiance, and it was now poised to strike the heart of the Gorlith fleet. As the two sides squared off in the cold vacuum of space, the tension was palpable. The Gorlith launched wave after wave of energy blasts, trying to tear through the human defenses. But the humans responded with deadly precision, evading the onslaught and retaliating with their own ferocious firepower. The battle was chaotic, with massive explosions lighting up the void as Gorlith warships were torn apart one by one. The once formidable invaders, now disoriented and panicked, found themselves unable to adapt to the humans' unrelenting pressure. But as the battle raged on, something unexpected happened. A Gorlith flagship, the largest of its kind, broke through the chaos and advanced toward Earth's fleet with alarming speed. Its weapons powered up, preparing for a final strike. It was clear that the Gorlith were gambling everything on this one ship. If it could land a crippling blow to the heart of the human resistance, it might turn the tide of the war. The flagship's energy disruptors began to charge, a deadly hum echoing across the stars. In response, the humans formed their own final line of defense. They knew this would be the battle that determined the fate of Earth and the fate of the galaxy. The ancient ships, once buried deep beneath the Earth's surface, now served as humanity's vengeful sword. Their weapons, charged to maximum power, locked onto the Gorlith flagship, their targeting systems precise and lethal. A series of pulses, bright, jagged flashes of light, blazed through the darkness as the human fleet fired. The flagship's shields shimmered, then collapsed under the intensity of the attack. With a roar, the flagship's core exploded, sending a shockwave rippling through the surrounding ships. For a moment, the Gorlith fleet seemed to falter, stunned by the magnitude of the destruction. The human forces pressed their advantage, pressing on with relentless precision. As the flagship was consumed by the explosion, the Gorlith's final hope seemed to flicker out. One by one, their remaining warships fell, the might of their fleet reduced to debris scattered across the stars. The humans had struck the decisive blow. The Gorlith were no longer a threat. Back on Earth, celebrations erupted. People hugged, cried, and cheered in the streets, not just for the victory, but for the realization that they had done the impossible. They had stopped an unstoppable force. But as humanity looked to the stars, they understood that this victory wasn't just theirs. It was the galaxy's victory. The Gorlith had fallen, and with them, the oppression that had once held countless systems in their iron grip. The fight for Earth had been won, but the war was not over. The victory had ignited something greater, a rebellion that would spread across the galaxy. The Gorlith Empire had crumbled, but its fall had marked the rise of something far more powerful, the hope of countless star systems rising to take control of their own destinies. And humanity, once thought weak and helpless, was at the forefront of that revolution. The final battle had been fought, and the Gorlith were no more. The vast empire that had once stretched across the stars lay in ruins, shattered by the unyielding force of humanity's resistance. The aftermath of the war was a mixture of triumph and somber reflection. Humanity had survived the invasion, not just by strength, but through determination, ingenuity, and the legacy of their ancestors. Earth, though battered and scarred by the conflict, stood united. The planet had rallied like never before, and as the dust settled, it became clear that the victory was not just military. It was cultural, emotional, and spiritual. Humanity had proved to the galaxy that they were not to be underestimated. Their history, long dormant, had been awakened, and it was a history filled with the tools to fight and the spirit to endure. In the wake of the battle, the survivors of the Gorlith Empire began to scatter. Some, still loyal to their dying cause, tried to regroup in the distant corners of space. Others, realizing the futility of their struggle, sought refuge in the uncharted systems, hoping to escape the wrath of the humans. But it was too late. The remnants of the Gorlith were no longer a threat. The humans had not only defeated their would-be conquerors, but they had also sparked a movement that would sweep across the galaxy. The other systems, those that had been under the thumb of the Gorlith for centuries, now saw an opportunity. Earth's victory had become a beacon of hope. Messages of resistance, of freedom, began to flood in from the farthest reaches of the galaxy. Planets that had once cowered under the Gorlith's oppressive rule began to stand tall. And as the survivors of the Gorlith fled to the edges of space, they found that they were no longer feared. They were hunted. Humanity, united by the memory of the war and driven by the desire to ensure such a threat could never rise again, began to extend their influence beyond their homeworld. But it wasn't through domination. It was through cooperation. Earth's message was clear. Peace was possible, but only through mutual respect and freedom for all. With their fleets now expanded and their technology tested, humanity set their sights on rebuilding the galaxy. The ancient ships that had once lain dormant beneath Earth's surface were now at the center of this new era. The knowledge from these relics became the foundation for a future filled with new alliances, new governments, and new explorations. The future was no longer uncertain. It was in humanity's hands. Earth's leaders, once divided by politics and fear, now came together in unity. The war had forged a new world order, one based on cooperation, survival, and hope. Humanity had not only won the war, they had emerged as a symbol of what was possible when a species refused to give in to fear. Across the galaxy, systems that had once lived in fear of the Gorlith now looked to Earth as a beacon of strength. The newly formed alliances began to rebuild, sharing knowledge and resources. Earth's military might, once focused solely on defense, was now poised to assist in the rebuilding of a galactic order built on equality and shared responsibility. The war had ended, but the work of forging a new peace had only just begun. And in the quiet after the storm, humanity stood as the architects of a new dawn. A dawn where they were no longer the helpless prey of the stars, but the resilient masters of their fate. They had survived the darkest hours, and now they would help lead the galaxy into a future where freedom, peace, and unity reigned. The fight for Earth was over. The fight for the galaxy had only just begun.